Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video, for something a little different, I'm going to be talking about those strange, dumb character deaths that we all see in games. And I'm going to be giving you an example of some of them that I've seen in games I've either played in or ran. Some of the character deaths are mine and some are other people that I've roleplayed with over the years. I've got my little list here, so let's get cracking with that. The very first one was in a Demon the Fallen game that I ran. Demon the Fallen is an excellent game. The players take on the mythic demons of the biblical fall who have been confined in the abyss for many years and have escaped to embody themselves in human hosts. However, they can take on a demonic form. Well, in this session of the game, we had two of the player characters had broken into an explosives base. They required a quantity of explosives for some of their nefarious schemes. They'd broken into a military base. So there they are, these two demons. They're stood. It's pitch black in the middle of this base. I describe it as explosives lining the shelves. They're all packaged neatly. One of the player characters asks me whether they can have a look at the labelling on the explosives so they can make sure they get exactly what they want. It being very dark in there, there's no lights turned on. They've entered by stealthy means. They've been trying to keep it a little bit quiet. I say to them, well, I'm afraid it's too dark to read the labels on there. You need a bit of light. At which point, one of the players who's playing a fire demon decides that he's going to illuminate the explosives warehouse, and I'll say that again, explosives warehouse, by transforming into his demon form, which is the standard huge fiery demon, brimstone, flames licking off his skin, etc. So, of course, the expected happens when a large amount of fire is introduced into an explosives warehouse. There's an almighty bang and the whole place goes up. Now, that would have been ridiculous enough. However, the fire demon is immune to the fire. So, making a quick judgment call, I say, well, okay, you're immune to the fire. However, there's still concussive force. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll halve the damage for you. However, for the unfortunate other demon who's there, a beast demon, he's going to have to take the full brunt of it. So what eventually ends up happening is these demons port in, one of them lights up, there's this huge explosion, the fire demon is flung many feet to land on his side, winded but otherwise unharmed, whereas the unfortunate beast demon is incinerated almost instantly. We then move on to a person playing a gargoyle in a Victorian age vampire game I ran. He had a habit of flying up high into the air and performing a dive bomb attack on the enemies, which unfortunately, due to poor dice rolling, normally resulted in a miss and him drilling himself several feet into the ground with high levels of potence and spending the rest of the combat digging himself out. Now, you think that would be enough to discourage anyone from continuing this manner of combat, but no. Fair play to him, he had a great deal of perseverance and that still remained his standard combat tactic. However, on this occasion, he had been fighting against some enemies, drilled himself into the ground, dug himself out, and the enemies had inflicted enough damage on him before they fled to torporize him, which left him in a bit of an unfortunate position because the sun was going to be coming up soon. He's lying in this back alleyway. It's not looking too good for the gargoyle, but it's not insurmountable. Not insurmountable unless one of the other players who's playing the Tremere sort of master of this gargoyle comes walking along, having wondered where his gargoyle's got to, since he's sent him off on a mission of some import and the gargoyle has not returned. He sees the gargoyle lying sparked out in the back alleyway, and with a long suffering sigh, He reaches inside his pocket, takes out the one remaining stick of dynamite from the operation that he'd been undertaking earlier on that evening, wearily puts it inside the gargoyle's mouth, lights the fuse, shakes his head again, and walks off. Now, the first thing the player asked me was, could he potentially have a fortitude save against that? Now, I'm not sure what people think about it, but as far as I'm concerned, if a large explosion goes off in this sort of area and does, which it did, quite a large amount of damage, that's more than enough to count as decapitation. So the unfortunate gargoyle did not survive that. We then had a D&D game where a friend of mine was playing a paladin called Sir Boris, and he'd been taking he'd been a fairly sort of backseat paladin. He'd not really been the sort of forthright zealot you'd expect. He'd not been crusading overly much to destroy evil. And we were running it in the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, a setting book that I've got. And it's a sort of corrupt city ruled by an evil government. And in this version of the city that we were running in, Sir Boris had discovered that his paladin order itself had been corrupted, and all of his brothers had been brought under the evil sway of the Invincible Overlord. Now, to this day, myself and my regular group aren't sure entirely what happened. However, he was confronted by one of these corrupted paladins, and they're facing off against each other in a climactic scene. And the corrupt paladin looks at Sir Boris and says, "We will settle this in the honourable way via single combat," and he lifts his sword up. He's clad all in plate mail, the standard sort of paladin stuff, swings down off his war horse, hefting his sword. And it was that moment, for that brief shining moment, that it was almost as though all of the suppressed paladin instincts that had been lacking from that character in the rest of the game suddenly surged forward. And when the traitor brother said, "Shall we make this to first blood?" without even missing a beat, the player responded, "No, to the death." And despite them having pretty much equal stats, unfortunately in this case Sir Boris didn't prevail, but for that one shining moment he was the epitome of his knightly order, his warrior order. And players in my regular group still talk about it even now to this day. It was a shame we didn't see a little bit more of that, but it was nice that at least once before the character died he had that sort of moment of roleplay. Next is an unfortunate character of mine named Quattro Formaggio, who was a werebear, a Goral, in a strange sort of far future setting that my friend John was running, where a lot of the typical social mores of vampire, werewolf, the various other Old World of Darkness games had almost completely changed since we were in the far future. And through various hijinks we end up coming across this abomination, which is an almost manically depressed and homicidal were creature that has been turned into a vampiric shadow of itself. Now, normally there is a large sort of social prejudice against this sort of character. However, that wasn't present in the futuristic setting that we were running. So it ends up with Quattro and this abomination grappling backwards and forwards, trying to one-up each other. And unfortunately, for my character, eventually the strength of the abomination begins to tell, and it bears down on the poor werebear, sinking its vampiric fangs into his neck. As I'm making, and to be honest, failing most of the tests, and I'm slowly having my life force drained away by this vampiric abomination, it occurs to me that as my character is mainly concerned with his own life, what has he got to lose? So with his last gasp, he attempts to bite into the abomination and drink its blood in the hope that he will become an entity like it. Unfortunately, despite the character with his last gasp shouting for the abomination to make him like it, I failed the test and it didn't really happen, which was a bit of a shame. I would have liked to have seen what happened with that, since it's not the sort of character you normally get to play, but c'est la vie, that's the way it goes. To bring in a bit of LARP, or live action roleplay, which is also a part of the hobby that I enjoy, I went to a LARP event that was taking place at a scout camp. We had a player who unfortunately lost his character. His character died at the hand of the monsters and the NPCs of the event. Now, we've been told before the event that this was a live environment, which effectively meant that if your character died, you had to go back to the cabin where all of the computers and all the information about characters and NPCs were stored, create a new character. You then had to walk to the edge of the site and make your way to the player camp through the woods and the paths, etc. Now, this poor unfortunate soul, he lost his first character, genned up a new one, travelled to the edge of the site, starts walking down the road, and wouldn't you know it, he just, through sheer bad luck, happens to run into a party of monsters who make short work of this lone character, killing him, all in the space of about 5 minutes. So this poor guy then has to trudge back to the god tent, or the command tent as it's called, and create a third character. I think that's possibly the only time I've seen a person go through 3 characters in a single event. There was also a D&D game I ran where we had the same person who played Sir Boris, actually, playing a scion who had a sentient crystal which was part of his personality that sort of hovered around him, whizzing around his head. And I asked him what sort of aspect of his personality it was as I was running the game, and I NPC'd the Psi Crystal effectively. Now, we ended up with 2 of the other player characters, a sorcerer who had a vastly enhanced flight spell, and a monk, which is, I'm not a fan of the class. I believe it was in the Forgotten Realms where they've tried to give the monk a little bit more setting specific flavour, certainly in D&D 3.5. And we ended up with this sorcerer with his enhanced flight spell flying along with the monk sat on his back, being pursued by the form of this huge black dragon, and the sorcerer is frantically making rolls. He's dodging in and out of trees. However, his magical resources are taxed to the limit. He knows he can't keep up this flight for long, and so he decides, well, if both me and the monk are going down, then there's no way we're going down without the scion coming with us. And the scion having left somewhat earlier in the game and taken a different path through the forest, the sorcerer deliberately flies over where this scion is, and of course the black dragon does what black dragons do best. It belches a huge stomach full of this caustic acid onto the scion as it passes over, cindering trees, scorching the soil and burning the scion to a crisp. As the sorcerer flies off, hoping that that's distracted the dragon enough for him to get away, the last thing he hears as he zips off into the distance is the telepathic cry of the Psi Crystal as it slowly begins to melt into the pool of acid. And this sorcerer, who's been a fairly remorseless character thus far in the game, suddenly pauses for a moment and goes, "Oh, damn, I forgot about the Psi Crystal. I actually quite like the crystal." and I believe that was the only sign of real emotion that character actually showed in the game. We also had a mage game where we had a friend of mine, John, not the same one as earlier, but playing a mage called Cardigan, and he was attempting to effectively torture information out of somebody using his magic, his mastery of death magic, and his plan was he was going to slowly flay the soul of this individual until they delivered up the information that he needed. Now, I said to him beforehand that there's a high potential that you'll cause some paradox with this. It's a very vulgar effect. The person you're trying to interrogate isn't a mage. He was fine with that. He makes his roll. Sure enough, as the dice clatter across the table, a paradox effect occurs. Now, we look at the effect on the GM screen and it says that this spell has rebounded. We make a random roll to see who it's rebounded on, and as the scene plays out, what effectively happens is Cardigan goes in, he threatens this terrified man, reaches out towards him, then collapses as his own soul is flayed by his own rebounding spell. As the rest of the characters come running in to find out what the hideous scream was that they've heard, all they see is Cardigan's body lying on the floor and an absolutely terrified man still fastening to the restraints, saying, look, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, because as far as I'm concerned, this NPC just thinks that the characters are crazy. This guy started to torture him. He comes in and he's so crazy he actually kills himself in front of this terrified man. So they still actually ended up finding out the information they wanted anyway. Turning over the page, another LARP one, a Mind's Eye Theatre, a live action vampire one. Myself and my friend John were playing Assamites in a Camarilla 5. Yes, I know, but we were, and we'd been standing there. The game was slightly delayed, so I have to admit we'd had a couple of drinks beforehand since it was in a pub, and we were stood at the side of the room as a hugely powerful Tremere Justicar storms into the fife to lay down the law to the player characters, which is something which seemed to happen an awful lot, certainly in the Met games that I've played in. And we both stood there, myself and John, look at each other, and almost at the same time we both glance at this Tremere Justicar, who's tremendously more powerful than us, but we are Assamites, we are specialised in killing with a kindred, and almost at the same time we just go, yeah, let's have him. And the two of us leap on this Tremere Justicar, knowing that we've got the drop on him, but we've probably got only like one combat round to take him down. Otherwise he's going to whip out all his thaumaturgies and his vampiric magics, and he's going to lay waste to us. And as is often the case with these sort of things, we were that close to having him dealt with. If we'd have had one more vampire who'd have come in with us, we'd have probably got him. We had this hugely powerful figurehead of the Camarilla down to 1 health level, but we just couldn't inflict any more damage on him in the round, despite all of our supernatural celerity, quickness and quietus and whatever. And of course then he shouted for the rest of the kindred in the fife, who, seeing he was going to survive, joined in on his side, and they completely annihilated our characters utterly. But we were that close to getting rid of him. We had a random game once where we had a mage who was called Edward Rice, who travelled into the spirit lands with some of his companions, and when they were there they encountered a knife spirit, which I described as something along the lines of, you see in front of you a roughly human figure, save for the fact that instead of flesh and bone, it is composed entirely of razor sharp knives and blades sticking out at different angles. What I didn't expect when I described that was for the player who was controlling Edward to say, I'm going to attempt to grapple him. And it had the expected result, which resulted in the player character's death as he took damage for grappling, since he was effectively throwing himself onto a bed of sharp knives, and then the creature attacked him back and inflicted even more damage. We've got to give an honourable mention to the dwarven griffin rider who coined, in the Forgotten Realms, who coined the phrase axes from the skies, but always spent so long manoeuvring his griffin mount to get it into a position relevant to the combat that he never actually got to use his leap off and swing axe down from a great height manoeuvre. We have the vampire, a member of the Oberlock bloodline, who attempt... Now, the Oberlock bloodline, if you don't know Vampire the Requiem, are effectively a sort of hillbilly style family who prize family loyalty above and beyond everything. If you betray them, that's it. They will have nothing more to do. They will attempt to destroy you utterly, or if you cross their family. We had this player playing a member of the Oberlock bloodline, and he'd managed to do all manner of various underhand things behind the back of the other family members, since he was something of a reluctant vampire himself. We got to a point where they finally discovered all of these things that he'd been doing, and they staked him and left him in the building. Now, I thought I was being fairly kind as a GM, since normally the Oberlocks would have just annihilated a family member who had betrayed them, but I thought, you know, we'll have him staked, maybe he'll somehow get out of this, maybe the other party members will come and rescue him. What I hadn't betted on is that the other player characters getting into a fracas with the Overlocks was going to result in the building catching fire and pretty much everyone fleeing the scene, which left the unfortunate staked vampire to slowly burn to death inside the building. There wasn't really any way out of it. There was a game a friend of mine ran, which was an Anarch Old World of Darkness vampire game, where I played an Assamite extremist who was something of an explosives expert. He'd been embraced into the Anarchs because he had these contacts as explosives knowledge, and they thought they could use it against the prevailing sects, the Camarilla and the Sabbat. Now, we were trying to negotiate some sort of peaceful resolution to a problem with one of the sects when the Sabbath decided that they didn't want to negotiate. They'd come here to kick ass and take names, and that was all they were going to do. So they turned up, issued loads of threats, and basically threatened to destroy us all. At which point, my character, who is armed to the gills with explosives, and yes, it's not the sort of character I'd normally go for now, but it was a few years ago, I was a bit younger. He's got belts full of grenades over him, effectively. He pulls one of these grenades out, flicks the pin off, still holding the handle down, and says, well, I believe that I'm going to a worthy place in the afterlife when all this is over. So if you want to test me, I've got nothing to lose. Bring it. At which point, thinking they're being smart, a Sabbat Nosferatu who's been lurking about invisibly appears and clamps onto my hand with his potence-assisted strength, effectively crushing my hand into the grenade and making it impossible for me to release it. And with a rather smug-looking attitude, the Sabbats say, oh, well, you might be prepared to blow yourself up, but you can't now, and basically go to my character. At which point, and I'm sure many of you will see this coming, my character responds by ripping the pins out of several of the other grenades that are strapped to his chest, and there is a large explosion which takes almost all of us out and pretty effectively dealt with that situation. We have a couple of next what I consider to be probably some of my most ridiculous character deaths in games run by my friend Craig. There was one when I died by being stabbed by a wyvern's tail, a wyvern's stinger, and we were just the party was just travelling across some plains. It had been described as a bit of a misty morning, some clouds in the sky, nothing particularly to set you on edge, and we're walking along to our next destination when suddenly a wyvern descends out of the sky towards us and makes an attack against my fairly low level mage, I think it was. Effectively stabs me straight through the back and out of my chest with its stinger before taking off and flying off into the distance. So all the rest of the other party see is we're all walking along. All of a sudden my character just goes "Ah!" and disappears, and that was the last they saw of me. Later on in, I think it was probably the same game, we had a combat, again fairly low level. I don't know whether Craig had miscalculated the appropriate levels of the combats or whatever, but we came across an ogre, and I was playing a slightly more fighty character now, so ogre, you know, he doesn't, looking at him, I was like, yeah, he doesn't look too tough, we could probably deal with this, I'm the only real fighter available at the minute, let's go. Head in, engage warrior in combat, at which point it turns out that this ogre apparently has about 6 levels of the barbarian class, and he enters what I can only describe as the mother of all berserker rages. And literally, if you imagine that there's this huge ogre there and my character stood there, then a couple of seconds, if that, pass, and the next thing, there is no character stood there, there's just a fine red mist drifting down towards the floor. We also had another player character in possibly the same game, I forget. We were all trekking through a swamp, and this swamp was renowned for having hostile wildlife and plant life. So we're all trekking through. My friend Matt is acting as the scout. He's a sort of rangery type, and the GM says to him, okay, so how far ahead are you ranging ahead of the main party? And Matt says, I'm going quite far up ahead because I want to have a lot of advanced warning if anything dangerous approaches. The GM's like, fair enough, no problems. Okay, make me an initiative roll, because unbeknownst to us, in the area that he's entering, there are a number of assassin's vines, effectively ambulatory plants that can constrict you with their vines and pull you into the swamp where their prey would drown, and they would slowly feed off the decomposing bodies that lie amongst their roots. So he's ranging off up ahead. He fails this spot roll, then fails a grapple roll. These assassin's vines grab hold of him, pull him down under the water. Of course, the rest of us don't know anything about this because he's too far up ahead. We don't hear him being pulled under the water. By the time we get even vaguely into that area, he's already drowned, so there's no struggle, there's no bubbles on the water, there's nothing for us to see, and we assume he must be further up ahead, and we carry on walking. It's only when we reach the very edge of the swamp that we're like, what happened to the scout? And as far as our characters are concerned, we just never saw him again. We never knew what happened to him. And for my final example, I was playing in a Star Wars game once. I think it was the D20 Star Wars game, and we had a sort of nobleman. My friend Craig's playing a nobleman. We had someone playing a Jedi, and someone else playing a Mandalorian bounty hunter. Now, this game, it really does epitomise to me the importance of getting a party that gels well together. The person who's playing the Jedi in this game obviously wanted to play the stereotypical sort of whiter than white, gooder than good Jedi who upholds the Force and the various tenets of their religion that they espouse. Excuse me. Whereas the rest of us were all sort of playing dodgy smuggler types, or droids or stuff like, say, Mandalorian bounty hunters. And this obviously caused an awful lot of friction, since every time we tried to get into some dodgy dealings, the Jedi would inevitably derail them with his philosophy of basically trying to do right by everyone and trying to make the world a better place. And whenever he tried to engage us in an enterprise that involved trying to do the right thing, we'd inevitably drag it down because we were smugglers in it for the credits. Until eventually one of the players, I think it was Craig, just snapped and turned into the Mandalorian. He just said, look, see this written note, I'll give you 5,000 credits for the Jedi's head. And I'm sure the last thing that the Jedi heard was the echoing blast of the Mandalorian's las gun as it went off and just drilled him neatly through the head, and that was him dealt with. So there are a few of the more ridiculous or funny character deaths and a couple of honourable mentions that I can think of. What strange character deaths and odd occurrences have you seen in games that you've played? I'd love to hear about them. I hope you've enjoyed this video. You'll click on like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments on this video, or you want to talk about the strange experiences you've had in your own games, please put them in the comments boxes down below, or hit me up in the Google Plus links, or even better, make your own video response and then post a link to it down in the comments box. Until I see you next time, take care and thank you very much for watching.